Um, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. I keep forgetting this, so I'm going to do it today. Let's begin with our land recognition. We'd like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place the land that UCSF sits upon their home. We are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Ramaytush Ohlone community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. All right, everyone, this is our second of 5 plus resident grand rounds, and today I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Santiago Rosso. Santiago is originally from Bogota, Colombia, and completed his undergraduate degree at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, followed by medical school at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. There, he was a founder of the Latino Medical Student Association chapter. He also completed coursework towards a master's in public health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He is currently a third-year resident within the Pediatric Leaders Advancing Health Equity Program and is also the co-leader of the resident-led Physicians for Inclusion, Social Justice, and Equity, or RISE coalition. Santiago, thank you so much for being here today, and I will pass it along to you.
Hey. Okay, can you guys hear me? Can you guys see the slides or not? There we go.
There you go, good.
Cool. And are you guys in the normal slides or the presenter mode?
I'm seeing the screenshot, so it looks good.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Okay, well, yeah, thank you for joining me. I'm gonna talk about today about the socio-emotional learning programs and the impact, as well as the opportunities they convey as far as bridging disparities in mental health. So yeah, I mean, Raul already touched on this, but I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people for starting. Also, no disclosures, no conflicts to disclose. Then very quickly, going over the objectives, I want to review socio-emotional development milestones and also some theories. Also, I want to explain and go over mental health disparities. Also introduce the concept of socio-emotional learning programs, their framework and the evidence behind these programs regarding mental health, as well as the typical different opportunities that they give us as far as addressing mental health issues and disparities. So why this topic? Specifically, it came about due to our partnership with GLIDE as part of the Pediatric Leaders Advancing Health Equity Plus program. GLIDE is a community organization centered on social justice that works based out of the Tenderloin neighborhood here in San Francisco. They help the community in many different ways, but our specific project that is me and 4 other Plus residents, we're working with the Family, Youth, and Child Care Center. And as you can see, they serve a pretty low socioeconomic level of population, and the majority of them, as you can see, about 4 out of 5, or 3 out of 4 are Latinx. So a little bit more about our partnership. We're specifically working with the after-school program in the FYCC of GLIDE, and we are mainly focusing on mental health, since this was the main need that was identified by the organizers of this after-school program, since they have noticed quite a few mental and behavioral health challenges, which I'll talk about in a little bit, in their children. And the overall goal of this partnership is to ideally be able to implement a multi-tier approach, a multi-tier interventions. But for now, we're specifically focusing on interventions that do not require mental health care provider presence. So a little bit more detailed information about the demographics of the after-school program. It's around 30 kids They are from kindergarten to 5th grade, so school age. Again, they come from families that are of low socioeconomic status. So the average, according to their latest report, is less than $23,000 a year. They come from very diverse and cultural and linguistic backgrounds. The most spoken languages at home versus Spanish, then it's Arabic. But they also have other languages that they speak at home. And most of them are from immigrant households. And again, 3/4 are Latin. So the problems that were specifically identified by teachers in the meetings that we have had are largely behavioral. They involve tantrums, also like their need for their emotional awareness during this outburst to kind of help them identify the emotions that they're having and why they're responding in this way. Teachers have also identified difficulty in coping with loss, specifically during sports, which causes a lot of friction in between children and can lead to further outbursts and can ruin the mood of the kids getting picked on for the rest of the day. They're also starting to have some interpersonal issues, especially the older kiddos, as far as boys trying to be cool and girls being mean to each other, quote unquote. And then they're also starting to experience some peer group issues, such as peer pressure and kids controlling one another or trying to control each other's behavior. So that being said, you know, a lot of children's behavior is greatly influenced by the development, as well as is a reflection to some degree of their mental health. And when speaking of development, we're specifically talking about their socio-emotional development. You know, school age is a period where there is a significant degree of socio-emotional development that occurs as far as intrapersonal and interpersonal development. So I'm just gonna go over the different stages that of socio-emotional development to kind of give a little basis of the intervention that I'm evaluating in this talk, as well as to better be able to understand the different disparities that these kids face, and also the strengths that they have during the different stages of development as they start to bolster their resiliency through this time in their lives. So here I listed not only milestones, so not only looking at the specific, you know, bright futures developmental milestones, but I also drew from a couple of texts specifically aimed at teachers that list different behaviors, skills, personality characteristics that children exhibit during these ages. Again, these are sort of ballpark ages of when these different behaviors or characteristics start to arise. And I highlighted the main ones that, you know, are either associated with the problems that the children in GLIDE are having, or that can potentially be leveraged in order to improve their mental health and help address some behavioral problems. So for example, here between 5 and 7 years of age, they're seeing the start of self-management behavior, identification of emotions, which is kind of one of the problems that teachers identified specifically during tantrums. Also things like coping mechanisms and resiliency, things like empathy, and kids at this age also start nurturing and establishing positive relationships that start building their support network. In the following stage, between 8 and 9, they start becoming a little bit more independent. They also start having a little bit more clear view of their own values and beliefs. And at the same time, peer groups start playing a more important role in their lives. They start becoming more preoccupied with fitting in, with being accepted. They become a little more comfortable in hanging out with their peers compared to just being always with their family. At this age, we also start seeing kids having a best friend. So having like a very close person that they can confide on and be supported by. And then they also strengthen their cooperative skills. In the ages of 10 and 11, we start seeing puberty changes start to take their toll on kids. So they start becoming more self-aware and self-conscious of their body image. They also undergo emotional changes, a bit of emotional lability in their need for security of the familiar, kind of conflicting with the craving of the unknown that they start experiencing during this age. They also start refining their communication skills. Again, the peer group becomes even more crucial during this age. It becomes an actual emotional support for them, but peer groups are a double-edged sword at this age as well. They start becoming more prone to peer pressure. And at the same time, they start to show some maturity as far as taking responsibility for their actions, and they have improvement in their self-esteem and resiliency even further. So all that being said, the development of children and of anybody in general does not occur on a vacuum. Development is very much influenced by environment and also by social influences, but what surrounds the individual. So next, I want to cover a little bit of the different models, or specifically the Bronfenbrenner model of child development, which very nicely shows the multiple interactions at the different layers that the child interacts with, either directly or indirectly. So one of, or the most immediate layer is the microsystem. So this one usually makes up the parents, the peers, the school teachers, individuals that the child directly interacts with and has the most direct impact on the child. The child also is able to make changes to the way this system interacts with them by the way they react. So for example, like if they're very nice to their classmates, their classmate might be nice back. But if they're mean or whatever, the peer might not be as nice. So again, they're able to influence this environment directly. The mesosystem, which is the next level, are the actual interactions in between the different individuals in the microsystem. So an example of this would be the relationship between the parents and the teacher of the child. So this model kind of proposes that if that relationship, if the parent and the teacher don't get along, then this is going to affect the child's development, and in this case, more like emotional development to some degree. This one is actually, in what I read, is the hardest layer to kind of study accurately, since it's difficult to control. The exosystem is the next system. This one is the different social structures that affect the child indirectly. So for example, if the parent of the child loses their job, so then that's going to affect indirectly, it's going to have an indirect effect on the child. And same thing with policies. If there is like a policy that's going to affect the child's family, that is part of the child's exosystem. Moving on to the next couple layers, the macrosystem. These are more the socioeconomic and cultural elements that are already established. This layer is particularly important when thinking of immigrant children, as this is going to have a little bit of more complex relationship, as the culture they have at home is different from the culture of their host country. So navigating through those conflicts is something that's going to affect the child. So again, that's being relevant to the children that we are targeting with our intervention at Glide. And then lastly, the chronosystem. So basically the time component of it, looking at the different life events in the child's life. So this not only being, traumatic events, but also like different milestones or different, more usual, if you will, life events, such as, starting school or moving to a new school, or having a little sibling being born, which are not necessarily traumatic events, but they're definitely things that affect the child's development and the way the child interacts with their environment. So in a similar way, we can also look at the mental health from the socio-ecological model perspective. Again, I don't want you all to be too fixated about all the details. There's a lot in the slide, but the main thing that I want to highlight here is the fact that there are, again, multiple layers that influence mental health and the individual. Zooming in a little bit, here with the little red squares, I highlighted the different components that we can actually see mirror a lot of the milestones that start to form in the school age years. This is just a very not specific to children. This is a socio-ecological model and specific to children, but you can see that this is more like for adults, but again, development plays a role, identity and purpose, which again, we saw starts to develop between 5 to 7 years. Stress response and coping skills, again, 5 to 7 years. The peer relationships that start to develop more like 7, 8 years. Social connections and social roles, which are things that also start to come up during the school age, play a role throughout the individual's life and are big components in determining their mental health. Similarly, behavior, again, behavior is closely linked to the individual's mental health and as well as the individual development. This is more, again, a general model, just looking at the different spheres of influence. So after going through all these models, you can start seeing how disparities both in mental and behavioral health can begin to arise, particularly the one since the individual's mental health and behavior is largely dependent on the environment the individual is exposed to, and specifically thinking of the children at GLIDE, being of low socioeconomic status, being of immigrant background, being belonging to minority cultures, they can potentially be exposed to quite a few negative factors. So let's talk about disparities in mental health that these different environments might cause. So in general, the state of mental health in children in the United States is unfortunately not very good. According to the CDC, about 1 in 6 children aged from 2 to 8 years of age, so about 17% have been diagnosed with a mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder in 2016. Also, some studies have shown that the incidence of mood disorders such as anxiety and depression has been increasing, with studies showing that from 2003, it went from 5.4 to 8.4 in 2012 among 6 to 17-year-olds. And then just highlighting this figure is from the CDC data from 2018, just looking at the overall prevalence of mood disorders and as well as behavioral disorders across different ages. So as you can see, the older the child, the increased prevalence of mood disorders, but also important to highlight, and again, relevant to the children at GLIDE, who are more between the 6 and 11-year-old range, behavioral disorders are much more prevalent during this age range. So on top of this not so great state of mental health, there is also a lot of shortage in mental health providers. So according to the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, almost 4 in every 5 children with a mental health need do not receive services. On top of that, looking at it from a more national perspective, not a single state in the United States has an adequate supply of child psychiatrists, with about 43 states estimated to be in severe shortage, and this includes California. And then according to a report from 2016 from the US Department of Health and Human Services, they also project significant shortages in other behavioral health providers such as therapists and school counselors. So looking at the different mechanisms that underlie mental health disparities and affect outcomes, these are the classifications that are enumerated in the American Psychological Association latest report. So one big factor, and again, one that very directly impacts the children at GLIDE, is socioeconomic status. It is estimated that more than 1 in 5 children who live below the 100% federal poverty level has a mental health or behavioral disorder, compared to 14%. So not quite half, but considerably less than those in higher income households. It has also been shown in several studies that poverty can adversely affect the livelihood of a child, accessing mental health treatment or behavioral health treatment, and then also the quality that they receive is worse. In addition, we know that poverty more severely impacts minority populations, with 34% of African-American youth living in poverty and 33% of Latinx youth living in poverty, compared to 14% of the white American population. Childhood adversities, and this not only including ACEs, but also other stressful and traumatic events, as we know, have a big impact on children's mental health. This can further be augmented or an increased risk of childhood adversities in children of immigrant background. Again, immigration journeys can be pretty traumatic, and also the events that happen before immigration and the events that happen after immigration, increasing the risk of childhood adversity exposure. In addition to that, acculturation stressors have also been shown to increase feeling of marginalization and to lead to poor socio-emotional development, so directly affecting development and outcomes in children. And interestingly, the children of migrants, so not like the newcomers, but the second generation immigrants, have been noticed to have an increased prevalence of mental health conditions compared to first generation immigrants. Looking at other two factors, family structure. So this one was very interesting to me, since they zero in on single parent households as having an increased risk of depression. They highlight that this is not only due to decreased earning abilities and the limited resources compared to a two-parent household, but also it's important to highlight this could be there can be some repercussions from the cost of children living in a single parent household. So for example, looking at immigrant children, did they have a parent who was deported? Did they suffer family separation at the border? Or looking at just families of color in general, are they being disproportionately targeted by law enforcement and being incarcerated at high rates, leading to single family households? So again, increasing the propensity to adverse childhood experiences, and again, with minority youth being at increased living in a single parent household at increased rates. And then neighborhood level factors. Again, we're familiar with this. Things like safety, both from street violence or police violence, can lead to worse mental health outcomes, discrimination, segregation due to racist policies, and then neighborhood level factors can also affect social support. So looking at, in addition to that, which were the risks, now looking at barriers to accessing care. Here, this is the findings based on a study that is cited quite a bit by the American Psychological Association. This was a study from 2019 that involved focus groups of Latinx families with children, involving both those who had contact with mental health services and those who hadn't, and also involving mental health providers. The study was carried out in Colorado and involved 3 counties. They identified 3 levels of where barriers can occur that at least came up in these focus groups. So they included society, mental health systems, and family levels. I'm going to go through them briefly. So again, at the society level, low socioeconomic status, we have mentioned it like 4 times already. I feel like, again, makes it harder for family to access mental health services due to lack of resources. Systemic racism and discrimination was also identified by participants in this study as leading to decreased trust in providers and institutions. So again, withholding them from accessing care, and then the impact of racist policies that may decrease the presence of mental health providers around communities of color. And then also highlighted by both providers and family participants, the lack of minority representation in mental health, as this we'll see in the further levels, has quite a big impact in the propensity of families in seeking mental health care. So from the mental health system perspective, again, limited funding, mental health programs don't have the money to support the needs of the community, very siloed and isolated systems, so difficulty getting children a referral, or having not a lot of communication between schools and mental health centers, limited availability of language concordant services. So in this specific example, thinking of Spanish-speaking providers, which again, if these were not available, families felt a little more reluctant since they could not communicate as freely and felt like they weren't being understood as well as with English-speaking providers. And also, similarly, providers express their own feelings of inadequacy at provider culturally sensitive services, as they felt like they weren't able to connect as well with non-culturally concordant clients. And then bureaucratic barriers that including, intakes, phone calls, setting up appointments, and all that bureaucratic red tape that can be a big barrier for families, especially if they don't know how to navigate the system. At the family level, there were 2 different groups of factors. The more pragmatic one, the practical factors, so access to childcare, access to transportation, particularly important when there is like regular follow-ups required. Also cost, again, those economic status come into play. And specifically, not just looking at lack of insurance and payment for the doctor visit itself or the therapist visit itself, but also thinking of the ancillary costs such as parking, such as gas, such as daycare for the little sibling, things like that, the cost of not going to work or having to call off work in order to take the child to therapy. So all those costs also matter quite a bit. The difficulty scheduling, and that compounded again by the lack of providers, specifically more so of language concordant providers, which can keep families from accessing care. And then this one, a little bit more interesting, attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions of the families themselves, and not specifically just looking at the direct caretakers, but also the extended family. So even differences in the family were found to have some effect in becoming a barrier for children accessing care. So families having, or different family members having different thresholds of how severe, the symptoms or the situation should be in order for them to access care. Competing demands, such as a big family stressor that's happening, which might lead families not having a lot of time or a lot of bandwidth in order to have their child seek mental health care. Different perceptions, and the authors of this paper also highlight like the difference in perceptions between generations. So the difference between mom and grandma, they might have different perceptions of how to approach behavioral health issues or the significance or the cause. So that was also identified as a possible, difficulty to overcome. Again, cultural dissonance with providers that were of a different culture from from the families, led the families to feel like they were not, their cultural perspective was not being understood. They were fearful of judgment and dismissal. Also fear of stigma or concerns for stigma, not only regarding mental health in general, but also having their child, undergo mental health treatment, whether it be therapy or medication. And also lack of information about services and treatment. So kind of not knowing what to expect, how long the treatment is, what the treatment entails, and things like that kept families from participating. So now all that being said, how can we go and try to address all these risk factors, all these barriers, all these disparities, and particularly since populations like our children at GLIDE are at particularly high risk of. So that's where I want to introduce the concept of socio-emotional learning. These are basically skills that allow us to bolster children's strength and resiliency, and allow us to kind of leverage their own developmental milestones in their favor. So I'll go into a little bit more depth about this. So the concept itself was piloted by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, in 1994. I'll be referencing CASEL quite a bit for the rest of the presentation when I'm talking about SEL, about socio-emotional learning, particularly since they have been the ones that have championed the utilization of SEL and have continued to further research and the application of SEL in different settings. So their definition is SEL is the process through which individuals acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain support relationships, and make responsible caring decisions. But from a more pragmatic perspective, socio-emotional learning is basically an evidence-based framework that allows for the design of programs that teach this socio-emotional skills, knowledge, and attitudes to children or also adults. And yeah, they design evidence-based ways in which they can be taught and applied. So looking at the framework itself, I'm going to start with the 5 competencies. So the 5 competencies are the inner circle, the one that's orange, green, and yellow. These are kind of implemented through in every single intervention, and they are kind of like the constant through the different stages of development. The approach through which these competencies are taught and kind of like the specific goals in regards to each competency change depending on the child's developmental stage, but I'll go through them in a little bit more detail. So self-awareness is more understanding your own emotions, thoughts, and values. I highlighted here on the right a little bit of the developmental tasks or developmental goals that are related to self-awareness, that relate to the age range that we are dealing with at GLIDE. So again, identity, bolstering your identity, identifying the assets that you have in your person, in your culture, identifying your emotions, and again, growing the concept of self-efficacy. As far as self-management, once the emotions or thoughts or values have been identified, then we need to learn how to manage them. This one also adds the dimension of behavior and the adaptability to different settings. So being able to navigate different scenarios and through things like self-discipline and self-motivation, developing coping skills to deal with difficult situations, again, management of emotion. is part of this core competency. And then these are more the interpersonal competencies. So social awareness, being able to understand other individuals' perspectives and empathize with others, and being able to interact with individuals from diverse backgrounds, cultures, contexts. So developing developmental skills like empathy and compassion and gratitude, and then relationship skills itself, more establishing and maintaining relationships. And again, as we saw in the developmental milestones section, peer support is huge in the school age, and honestly from there on out, but particularly important in the late school age, like 8 to 12, starts playing a significant role. So teaching kids how to nurture those relationships, and at the same time, how to navigate social pressure and how to resist it appropriately, and also communication and teamwork and collaboration. And then the last one of the 5, responsible decision making. So this one, again, influencing behavior a little more than the other ones. The other ones is more like intrapersonal or interpersonal relationships, so learning how to make informed decisions, identifying solutions to different problems, developing critical thinking skills, and knowing how to apply them in different settings. So that's what this core competency is about. And then the concentric rings outside the 5 core competencies deal more with the different settings that these principles can be applied in. So again, we can see that this kind of reflects a little bit the developmental model that we talked about, the socio-ecological models that we talked about, as far as mental health, as far as behavior. Because again, what I like about this specific intervention is that it involves the different layers that the child interacts with, which matters as far as developmental mental health. So looking at the classrooms are mainly where the explicit instruction of these principles and these lessons take place. This also requires education of the teachers themselves about the principles, and utilization of developmentally appropriate lessons. And I'll show a couple of examples of a lesson in a little bit. And then ideally, it should also involve integration of the SEL curriculum, so its values and its approach to the other academic subjects such as math or science or social studies, in order to continue to work on those skills. So the lessons themselves, and honestly, this is kind of like the core to all the programs, is focusing on developmental tasks. So developmental tasks, and I listed some examples of elementary age children. Developmental tasks, which are not all of them, but a few of them, are the tasks that are able to tie the core competencies with the developmental stage the child is at. And the way they work is they not only kind of nurture and enable the child to kind of become more competent in the core competencies, but they also kind of set the stage for the next level of development, for the next lesson as far as like competencies. And then the good thing about this approach is that it leverages, again, the strength of the different developmental stages, increasing the child's resiliency and increasing their strength. So this is an example of a lesson. This one specifically is from a positive action program for 4th graders. So this specific program focuses more on, as an emphasis, positive actions to reinforce or to teach or to introduce specific core competencies. So this one, admitting strengths and weaknesses, which is the purpose of the lesson, would be more aligned with self-awareness. So kind of becoming aware of your own weaknesses, of your own strengths. So again, depending on the stage or on the stage of development the children are expected to be in, so in this specific example, fourth graders, they have different materials, and they have, in this case, for example, they have an introduction from the instructor, and then they have a little story, which I don't have here. And then they have a little activity, again, that's developmentally appropriate in order to reinforce or start building those skills around the developmental task of recognizing strengths and weaknesses based on the core competency of self-awareness. So kind of like the meat of everything occurs in the classroom, but that is not to say that the next spheres of influence are not important. Schools, and I'm gonna go a little bit quicker, we still have quite a few slides. Schools, again, ideally are a system of support and are able to reflect the values that are present in the core competencies. Families and caregivers play a huge role, and the most effective evidence-based SEL programs have been those that involve families, and ideally families should also partake and be at the decision-making table when we are planning interventions that involve, SEL competencies, in order to make them more culturally relevant, in order to make them more also not only like applicable at school, but so those competencies and that are being taught at the school can be also practiced at home. Community partnerships are also very important. These can be, from university research centers to healthcare providers to after-school programs. And the point of this would be to expand the network of support, and again, ideally be able to implement these principles in all the different environments the child interacts in. So looking at the effectiveness of SEL, so the biggest study, the most cited study, is this meta-analysis from 2011 that looked at 213 different SEL programs and over 270,000 children from K to 12. This one looked specifically at 6 different parameters, including SEL skills, academic performance, positive social behaviors, emotional distress, so mood disorders, attitudes, and then conduct problems or behavioral problems. As we can see, these are the blue bars represent the percentage of individuals that gain those skills that were participating in the program, and the ones with the green bar are the ones that didn't participate in the program. So we can see the effect size is quite considerable. Again, with the largest effect being on the skills themselves, but also having quite a significant effect on decreased emotional distress, so kind of like the mood disorders and behavioral issues as they improved or had less prevalence of. This is the same data. This is the same study that I mentioned, the 2011 meta-analysis, and then there's an additional meta-analysis. This is from compilation of meta-analysis that was done in 2018. Again, the asterisks show that they were statistically significant. So all the effect sizes of these interventions were statistically significant, with the exception in this second study of attitudes was the only one that wasn't. But again, looking at a large number of different studies or different programs. Looking at the more long-term, and I forgot to mention, this one looks more at the pre and post immediate effect. This one looked more at the long-term effect. So following up children that had undergone this intervention 6 months to 18 years after the interventions were done. This one was also a meta-analysis that looked at 82 studies, including 38 from outside the United States and almost 100,000 children. Again, all statistically significant effects on all these domains. This one added drug use. There is a lot of SEL programs that are focused on teenagers, particularly on behavior, and again, showed statistically significant effects, but to a lesser extent, so less strong than the one seen in the immediate pre-intervention and post-intervention. So this kind of led researchers to suggest that these interventions need to be continuous in order to maximize the effects. Other specific outcomes, these are more looking at mental health and behavioral outcomes. Really kind of going into details of what I had mentioned before. One that was of particular interest to me was this one. SEL was found to have preventive effects in the increase of acculturative stress in Latinx high school immigrants. Theoretically, acculturative stress is supposed to increase over time, but SEL was able to kind of halt this progression. So I found that interesting. So as far as addressing disparities, so looking specifically at the different ways in which SEL is able to ameliorate disparities in mental health and behavioral problems, Castle identified certain contributors that they theorize prevent health disparities. So they state that by promoting relationships, emotionally safe environments, socio-emotional development, and coping skills and resilience, we're able to decrease the exposure to adverse experiences, so kind of acting as a primordial prevention. We're also able to increase systems of support and bolster strength in children, being more like a primary prevention sort of method. Unfortunately, I could not really find much or any studies that evaluated these individual outcomes, in relation to SEL programs. So it's kind of hard for me to like ascertain the causality. Logistically, it makes sense because it's decreasing, for example, by improving the environment at school, the child is not going to be bullied, or by improving the environment at home, the child is not going to be disciplined in a harsh way and things like that. So that's going to decrease the ages of the child. But again, the specific evidence and the specific papers are not there. Increasing the access to mental health, Castle strongly advocates for multi-tier intervention to be implemented on top of SEL programs. SEL acts more as a tier 1 strategy, so kind of aimed at all students regardless of where they're at in their mental health. And these can also include screening. So again, kind of giving people who wouldn't otherwise have easy access to mental health the opportunity to get some mental health services through school or through whatever these programs are being conducted. And then it also enables the opportunity for these programs to become somewhat of a conduit, a facilitator for more targeted approaches by allowing teachers or program implementers to identify high-risk children, and ideally through collaborations with the community and different organizations, being able to expedite referrals and interventions. And then, to me, arguably one of the most important ones, partnership with families. There are many studies that show that cultural compatibility of these interventions can greatly influence outcomes by improving them. And the way this is done, and unfortunately, I didn't have time to add all this to my already long presentation. There are ways in which SEL programs can become culturally adapted. For example, the one looking at, the effects of like acculturation in Latinx high schoolers, which was translated into Spanish, and there were focus groups done with family members in order to make the examples and the lessons more culturally relevant and more applicable to the social problems that these youth were facing. So involving the families in the process is very important because of that. And also it can improve the caretaker's SEL skills. It can change the way things are done at home, the way problems are resolved, or the way the child is disciplined for whatever behavior. And then it can also help educate families about mental health, help normalize conversations, help reduce the stigma around mental health treatments and mental health conditions. That being said, there's also some limitations regarding the potential of SEL in addressing disparities. One that I have already talked about a little bit is the fact that these programs are not explicitly focused on mental health disparities. They are very, very much focused on academic success, academic outcomes. They are very much tailored towards school settings, towards school districts. And in the multiple programs that I looked into, there is a lack of material that is explicitly aimed at families, at communities. There is some guidelines of how to build partnerships, but as far as when you actually look at the programs, it's more how can teachers teach this in the classroom setting, and not so much how can we include families, how can we reach out to the community, how can these principles and these lessons potentially be extrapolated and taught in the home setting. There's quite a lack of that. So I feel like that is something, along with needed research as far as how this can help address mental health disparities in order to tailor these interventions and these programs more to address mental health disparities, all that is lacking at this time. Similarly to what I already mentioned, lack of multicultural approach. If we want to do cultural adaptations, which has been shown to be successful, it can be expensive, it requires consultants, it requires focus groups, it requires time, it requires interpreters or translators. So it's not easy. And programs that have done this already and have the materials already provided for different cultures or in different languages are very few. Here is a list sponsored by Positive Action. You can see all the green check marks, but they have their own issues. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. You can see that these are different SEL programs, and you can see that the ones that specifically target family are like less than half of the ones they show. Again, there are hundreds of these programs, so this is by no means an extensive list. The ones that target community, very few. The ones that target school climate, again, to implement things at the school level, very few, and not all do it in a bilingual manner, much less in a multilingual manner. So for example, thinking of the families like Glide in Arabic, I couldn't even find many, if any at all, that had material in Arabic. Another big limitation is the cost. This one, again, is from Positive Action. So you can see that it's quite expensive. This one is for 30 students, and this is just for kindergartners. It does, the family toolkit costs a few more hundred. Teachers and the education or the support they might need also cost several hundreds. Yeah, community outreach materials also cost several hundreds. And ideally, since these interventions are supposed to be done in a more longitudinal fashion, so next year, some of these materials might run out, so you might need to buy another one. And then this doesn't take into account what is recommended by CASEL as far as doing a evaluation, measuring the outcomes, doing an evaluation of the process, modifying, so potentially having more focus groups, more outside consultants. That is all costs that are not really factored in. This is just the materials. So it has the potential to become quite expensive. There were other ones. This was honestly the most expensive one that I saw, but there were others that were, like a handbook was $40. But if you have 30 students, that can add up. And again, that's just the handbooks for the children. But what about the families? What about the community? What about the teachers? So again, this definitely puts a limit, a break on how much you can actually help those of low socioeconomic status, because you need the means in order to be able to implement these programs. So next steps. Yeah, as far as, looking back at Glide and kind of what the next steps will be, we're still, talking and looking at different interventions that we're thinking of doing. I kind of went over many of the good and bad things that we need to consider. I'm planning on presenting this information to Glide. We actually have a brief talk now, or today, but yeah, I don't think I'll have the opportunity because I have to kind of adapt this talk a little bit to make it more pertinent to their needs, looking more at like different programs. The ones that I'm looking at, and sorry, I didn't have time to go into detail about them, is maybe positive actions, because again, is the one that is more involved in all the different layers, but there's also other ones that are a little bit cheaper, depending on what's more appropriate for the organization. So again, we'll have to talk and evaluate many things, as including like the appropriateness to the needs of this community, the relevance of the content to the children they serve, maybe considering, holding focus groups or involving the family in the implementation process to make it a little bit more relevant. And then if we decide to do it, it's expensive. So we're going to need to secure funding and then discuss potential collaborations and implementation to make it a multi-tier approach. I think I finished right on time. I want to thank Dr. Gutierrez for all his help, as well as Catherine Helena and Dr. Margolis that helped me with this presentation. These are my menu references.
Thank you so much, Santiago. I want to be mindful of the time. It is 9 o'clock already, and so I know people have to move on to their work day. Thank you so much for presenting this for us. If people, I don't know if you have time, Santiago, but if people want to stay for like 5 minutes and ask Santiago any questions, you're more than welcome to, but certainly understand if you need to move on. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Is anybody still on? Want to ask Santiago any questions? A lot of thanks and congratulations, Santiago, on the chat. All right. I think we're good then. Thank you so much, Santiago.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.